The question is that the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And given the splits and divisions in the National Party, I'm amazed that this bill has actually got this far into the House, because given the level of property ownership across the National Party there must be many who have been uneasy about bringing this bill to the House, because, Mr Speaker, the reality of the property market is that the highest common denominator drags up the value for everyone else. And everyone else in this case is the poor New Zealanders who are trying to get onto the property ladder in Auckland and simply have not been able to afford to do so. Mr Speaker, this is not a road to Damascus, rather a street to Damascus piece of legislation. It's hardly a bandage, more like a band-aid for a major issue facing not only New Zealand, but Australia and Hong Kong and Singapore, who have all moved to make significant changes in legislation to stop what they see as a flood of foreign investment into their property markets. Well, this is the best that the national government can do. They can't even decide whether it's for a register of foreign investors or not. We've got the Prime Minister on record, Mr Speaker, saying things like, well, we're not sort of absolutely resolute that it's such a terrible idea. We just think that we have a fairly good information already. But then we're told that this piece of legislation is actually not a register, but it's to gather information. Well, quote, it's quite a tricky thing, the register. It's not quite as straightforward as people think. So we're not afraid of a register. That's the Prime Minister. Is it for registering foreign owners of property in this country, or is it not? Mr Speaker, it's a pathetic piece of legislation, but in the absence of anything else, the opposition will support it to select committee, Mr Speaker. Because the government, in trying to portray this view that it's got newfound empathy for poor New Zealanders trying to have a home, Mr Speaker, these are Kiwis who need, who deserve and who want a home, somewhere to bring up their families in security. Because, Mr Speaker, the laws as they are around rental properties and the exposure that those people have from landlords who want to flick their property on means that we have over 50% of the people in Auckland living in rental properties and living in security. Mr Speaker, that is not good enough. The Labour Party was founded on the basis that we put people into secure homes and offer them a job and some security for the future. Mr Speaker, this bill is a pathetic, and as I say, it must have been an interesting caucus trying to work out whether they should put this bill up or not, given the statements of denial time and time again from ministers across the House there. They don't need a register. They don't need to address the issue. Mr Speaker, if there's one person, perhaps two people who should be credited with this piece of legislation, one's Phil Twyford, Mr Speaker, who's been pushing and pushing, and the other person, Mr Speaker, the other person is Fran O'Sullivan. Because Fran O'Sullivan very clearly laid out in a column yesterday in the Herald, and clearly the National Party members have probably read this, even Mr Williamson would have read this. I mean, she's quite asking the question, are we prepared for the new wave, and it's only just the new wave, of $6.6 trillion in the hands of Chinese investors who want to go out around the world and invest in property. 6.6 trillion. Now, it's been estimated that we might get 3.3% of that. And that is $11 billion coming into New Zealand that is likely to further overinflate the property market without any guarantee of new homes and houses being built. Mr Speaker, this is a dilemma of monumental proportions. And the government's put a band-aid piece of legislation up. Mr Speaker, in Australia, they've moved. In Hong Kong, they've moved. In Singapore, they've moved to protect their people We're not xenophobic on this side, but we are patriotic. We're here for Kiwis. We're not picking on the Chinese, other than to say, due to their hard work and organisation, I have to remind the people, it's not a capitalist country over there, it's a communist one actually. And due to their success, they have trillions of dollars of capital that they want to invest. And the question is, will that money coming into New Zealand help Kiwis or not? Does Mr Williamson think that we need a register or not? What do his people in Auckland think about having to compete with foreign money when they go to an auction to try and buy a home for their family? Because that's what it's about. That's what it's about. So what we've got here, Mr Speaker, is a piece of legislation that moves towards a register. The question I have of the government, and it will be asked in the Select Committee, I'm sure, will this be extended to farmland? Will this be extended to farmland? Because the government, once again, has put up the argument time and time again, oh, it's far too complex. Oh, we can't have a register. It'd be too costly. Well, I say to the government, if they got a PC with a bit of grunt, they could have a register of all the foreign-owned property up and down this country in both residential and commercial and in farmland as well, Mr Speaker. It's been pathetic excuses. Why? Because their mates, the funders of the National Party, the real estate agents, Mr Speaker, and the people who have been doing very, very well out of this, haven't wanted to move in this area. Because as that investment comes in, it drags up the value of the property market, Mr Speaker, because there's not much more by way of new houses and new capacity coming on stream at the bottom of the market. The developers that we are told want to rush out and build more houses, they have a vested interest in slowly developing the properties that they have, not to flood the market with properties, to ensure that there is indeed an ongoing shortage and people are forced to pay more and more. And if it is the foreign investors who come in and help prop up that valuation, Mr Speaker, it's at the expense of ordinary, hard-working Kiwis who want to have a home. Well, Mr Speaker, we will, as I say, support this legislation to Select Committee. But I could go back to some wisdom, as I said, from Fran O'Sullivan, who must take some credit. Her timing was perfect. She put the column out yesterday, and we have legislation in the House today. But I have to say that my colleague Phil Twyford, Mr Speaker, who has been pushing the government, who's been holding their feet to the fire, who's been pointing out to the public of New Zealand, Mr Speaker, that the status quo is simply unsustainable. Can I quote Fran O'Sullivan, who's not been a great fan of Labor, but who does put up some very honest opinion. Quote, almost to the point of absurdity, the New Zealand government has been careful not to single out Chinese investment. The only reason I refer to it is the quantum of investment dollars sitting there looking for a home. We will have a register, or whatever the government wants to call it, for all foreign investors, and that's the way it should be. But let's not be naive about the amount of money that wants to come to a country that doesn't have an effective capital gains tax, that leaves the door open because it doesn't have a proper register of ownership. Mr Speaker, that's why the government should move and take some real action to protect New Zealanders and their families. Mr Speaker, the Labor government, or the Labor Party, will support this legislation into Select Committee, but I can put on record the fact that we will scrutinise every part of it to try and ensure that what is passed is effective in protecting New Zealanders, young Kiwis, and their dream that they too can one day own their own home. Because if we don't take more moves, if we don't do anything effective, then we will be flooded out by a wave of foreign investment. Mr Speaker, we only have to go to Australia or to Hong Kong or to Singapore, ask them why they have made these moves, and implement in a similar way protections for us. We're not xenophobic, but we are patriotic.
Sorry, the member's time has expired.